Hi, good morning, everyone. My name is Lara Merling. I'm going to be moderating this panel about economics of the steering wheel. Our first speaker this morning is Yeva Nersisyan from Franklin and Marshall College. Yeva, you have 25 minutes.
I will. Okay. Well, thanks for having me here. It's a pleasure to be here. It's always nice to be back at Levy. I think of Levy as my intellectual home, as do many of the people here, I think. So what I wanted to talk about today is the Fed's new policy framework, and this is work in progress, so any feedback is appreciated. It's a paper I'm working on and hopefully complete soon, so I would appreciate their feedback. So, and my conclusion is that it's the same old wine in newish bottles, so not much of a difference there. So what was going on with the Fed? And this started before COVID. And obviously we've gone back to debating what should the Fed do? Should the Fed be in charge of inflation? I mean, obviously the mainstream answer is yes, and mainstream economists have been very hawkish. They think the Fed has been too slow to raise interest rates. They should have done it sooner. They should have done their preemptive interest rate hikes, which they used to do. So the Fed has come under critique from the mainstream. Obviously, there have been a few voices on the post-Keynesian side arguing that, well, no, maybe patience was the best option all along. But all of this is happening in the context of the Fed revising their framework right before we started having the inflationary pressures. So sometime in at the end of 2019 and early 2020, before COVID, they were thinking about revising their framework. And in August of 2020, they said, okay, here is our new framework. And in a way, I see that as the result of the consequences of the global financial crisis. So it's kind of like an overdue revision because of what happened during the global financial crisis. At the time, obviously, the Fed changed its liquidity provision framework and decided to lend to anyone and everyone, right? But the monetary policy side of it was left intact. And so when Yellen became the chair, she started raising interest rates preemptively, even before there was inflation, right? So it went back to the same playbook. And then Powell comes into the picture, and the one advantage he has is that he's not a PhD economist, right? He has to be more pragmatic. So then he did something that almost no Fed chair has done before, maybe Greenspan just once, and he starts lowering interest rates, right, in the middle of the longest recovery on the record. And so they lower the interest rates, and they see that the inflation is not picking up, that the unemployment keeps going down, right? It goes below any estimate of the natural rate of unemployment that they have, even though those estimates keep moving, right? It's a moving target. And they don't see the inflation, and they're like, well, maybe it's time to rethink what we're doing here, okay? And this obviously also comes in a time where they have some internal people criticizing the Fed's framework, Tarullo, importantly, and Jeremy Rudd, and Randy has, in his paper, he's talked a lot about their own work, and I'll mention that briefly here as well. So what is the new policy framework? And at first, when you look at it, you're like, well, too bad, it's definitely an improvement, but I'm going to argue that at the end of the day, it's really not that much of an improvement. So they still keep their inflation target at 2%. They say, we're going to try to achieve an inflation of 2%, the target they adopted in 2020, but we're not going to strive for this every year. So over the long run, we want inflation to be at 2%. It's not clear what that means. How long is that long run, right? So they say if we have periods where inflation was below the target, we're going to let it go above the target for some time, just to have this average inflation of 2%, right? So there's a lot of uncertainty about how that's supposed to work in reality. Importantly, what they say is that they're no longer going to do the preemptive rate hikes. So they're not going to raise interest rates just because there is the unemployment rate has gone below the natural rate. And importantly, they kind of introduce this asymmetry, which is why mainstream economists are very mad at them. They're saying we're not going to react to deviations. So we are, if the unemployment rate goes below this natural rate, we're not going to react, right? We're only going to react if unemployment is above what we think full employment is, right? And then to react at all, we need inflation to actually materialize. And they kind of stuck to this, right? They waited for there to be actual inflation, and that's why they've come under fire from economists. So why the change in the framework? And I termed this one the good, so it's the good part of the framework and the only good part. So they say, well, the Phillips curve is no longer there. We don't have this relationship. We cannot count on it anymore. They're saying that even mainstream research shows that the slack in the economy is no longer correlated with prices. So we had a lot of slack, right, during the global financial crisis, and any other time they would expect it to be highly deflationary. We didn't see the deflation, and then at the same time we again had the longest recovery. We even lowered interest rates in the middle of it, and we still didn't see inflation or much inflation materializing, right? So they're saying that the degree of slack is not correlated with inflation anymore. So this is the good part, right? They're saying when the economy is robust, high employment in the absence of unwanted increases in inflation, or the emergence of other risks that could impede the attainment of the committee's goals will not by itself be a cause for policy concern, right? We're not going to raise rates just because unemployment is below the estimates of NAIRU or the natural rate. So in a sense, the new framework downplays one of the unobservables that the Fed has been relying on, the concept of the natural rate of unemployment, and that's the good part. However, they have a problem now, because if you don't have the Phillips curve relationship, if slack is not correlated with prices, then what is, right? And in the new monetary consensus framework, what that leaves you with is inflation expectations. So if you don't have a Phillips curve, then you have to rely on the other unobservable, which is kind of even worse, right? You have to rely on inflation expectations. So here is Tarullo saying that unless inflation expectations can save the day, the relative unhelpfulness of these past correlations, i.e. the Phillips curve correlations, leaves the FOMC without a working theory of inflation. So if we don't have the Phillips curve, we don't have a theory of inflation, and the only thing we have to fall back on are the inflation expectations. And he argues that inflation expectations, there are a lot of unanswered questions about it, and they are bearing a lot of weight, right? An awful lot of weight, he says. And so, to me, the Fed's revision is really an attempt to save its framework. It's it kind of is, right? So it leaves you with inflation expectations, and then you get into the circular reasoning. So the Fed's inability to reach its target in the post-global financial crisis period, right, where they had more than 10 years of inflation going below target, right? They're saying, well, that's dangerous because people are going to think we can't hit the target. And if people think we can't hit the target, then we can't hit the target because their expectations about inflation determine the level of inflation. So they're saying if inflation runs below 2% for a long time and never moves above it, then the inflation expectations are going to go down, right? People are going to expect inflation to be lower, and that is then going to create lower inflation. You're saying, but why is inflation running below 2%, you know, from the beginning? You can't explain that, right? So if inflation expectations depend on inflation, but inflation depends on inflation expectations, like how do you not see that it's like complete circular reasoning? And this is the read on which we're hanging our monetary policy, right? And it's a thin one. So this is the motivation, right? They want to have this averaging, and it gives them cover to say, well, if inflation is below 2%, it's not because we can't achieve our target, it's because we're letting it be there, and then at some point we're going to let it go above 2%, right? And that's how we're going to average it, and that's how we're going to anchor or maintain the anchoring of expectations at 2%, which is their target. Now, you might have seen this graph if you've seen Randy give a talk on the question of inflation. So we looked at inflation expectations, which were supposed to be causing inflation, right? And you see that inflation expectations haven't moved very much. And in fact, they move only after actual inflation materializes, right? And so as Randy says, expectations converge to reality and not the other way around. Actual inflation determines the expectations, which even the Fed admits, right? Which then leaves them without a theory of how inflation even comes to be. So the other unobservable that they still maintain is the concept of the natural rate of interest. So they don't have a natural rate of unemployment, but we still have the natural rate of interest. And they're claiming that this R star has decreased. And obviously, we know why the estimates of R star have decreased, right? Because the actual interest rates have been so low. But R star has decreased, and that presents a problem for them, because if you have a lower R star, then for you to be able to stimulate the economy with interest rates, right, you have to be below the R star. But if R star is already low, right, and getting lower because R star includes the expected inflation, then you don't have a lot of room to stimulate the economy because you have the zero lower bound, okay? So here are some Fed researchers who are saying that usually the Fed reduces interest rates by 4 percentage points during recessions, but if you are at a recession and you were already at the neutral rate to begin with, and it's below that 4%, right, the nominal rate, then you really don't have a lot of room to lower the interest rate to stimulate the economy. And so they're arguing that this lower bound is likely to be a problem in all future recessions, and that creates another problem because now the Fed is unable to inflate the economy, so this is going to again impart that downward bias to your inflation expectations, because people understand that the zero lower bound is likely to be binding more so than it has been in the past. So, and that then creates another circular reasoning here. If inflation expectations are low, then R star keeps going even lower, right? And then you have a problem. So, however, despite not having really a theory of inflation, the Fed still insists that inflation over the longer run is primarily determined by monetary policy. It's not clear how, but it is, right? Just trust us that it is. And then unemployment, however, over the long run is still determined by real factors. So it's like over the long term, we still have the natural rate of unemployment. Over the long term, inflation is a monetary phenomenon. So somehow we're in charge because of the central bank, right? But I feel like I think the current revision is kind of in line with previous revisions, right? You have a framework like money supply determines the price level, the quantity theory, and then the Fed controls the money supply. So that's your framework. But then you see the Fed cannot really control the money supply. Okay, so you take out that piece of the framework. And then you see that prices and money are not actually correlated. You take out that piece of the framework too, but you still maintain the conclusion that you started with, which is, well, the Fed controls the money supply and hence controls the inflation. So you take out the framework, but you maintain the conclusion, which to me is, I'll say silly, okay? So money supply is out, the Phillips curve is out, and only expectations are left. Nobody knows how they're formed and how the Fed can affect them, but still we have to trust that the Fed is in charge of the inflation rate. And this is the framework, but obviously when central bankers have to answer questions about how they're actually going to bring inflation under control, they have to then have some real world explanations, right? So this is Powell at Jackson Hole, most recently, saying that inflation is because of supply and demand factors. I mean, on this one, he's being good. He's been saying that it's been coming from the supply side. But then he's saying to solve the problem, we have to tighten monetary policy to slow aggregate demand. The problem is that we know that aggregate demand is not very sensitive to the interest rate. And here is the Fed's own paper. And the title couldn't be even, couldn't be better. Why is an investment more sensitive to interest rates? Please, can it be more sensitive to interest rates? And they're looking at surveys of CFOs. And what the CFOs tell them is that to do any investment project, we need a minimum return of like 15%, right? So 15% is your minimum that you need. So if the Fed is like changing the interest rate a little bit there, right, it's really not going to change their decision making, because that margin between the interest rates and the minimum return that they need is so big. The other thing they oftentimes will say is that, well, if we have to invest, we have to invest, right? You need to maintain your market share. You need to be competitive. You need to invest in new technologies to remain competitive. And oftentimes, especially the bigger firms will say that we finance a lot of our investment from retained earnings, so we're not that sensitive to the interest rate conditions, okay? So then when you look at this, you read all the Fed research around the new framework, you're saying there is a conclusion that's screaming at you from all of your own research. And the conclusion is that monetary policy is just not that useful for managing demand, right? And obviously this is rediscovering Keynes, right? But it is what it is. So if they're arguing that the lower bound is a problem, and to actually stimulate the economy, there are situations where you really need negative interest rates and sizable, level of negative interest rates, then you're looking at it and saying, but why not use fiscal policy, right? If what you're trying to do is stimulate demand, why don't you use fiscal policy? And all you have to do is look at the situation with the global financial crisis and COVID and say, okay, well, after the global financial crisis, we had trillions and trillions of dollars of monetary stimulus, right? We couldn't get inflation to the target, right? And the unemployment was very high for a very long time. And then we have COVID and we have a very rapid recovery. And if inflation what you wanted, you got it, right? So then you have to look at it. So even if you take the argument that fiscal policy was to blame for inflation, shouldn't that lead you to reevaluate your whole inflation fighting framework, right? You tried to reflate the economy for 10 years and you couldn't do it. And if you think fiscal policy did it, then fiscal policy was very effective, right, in doing it very quickly. So even if you stick to the inflation expectations framework, then you could say, okay, if we want inflation expectations to stay anchored and, all we have to do is stimulate the economy to prevent them from falling, then why not just use fiscal policy? So my argument is that we can't just rethink monetary policy. We need a wholesale rethinking of our macro framework. And the starting point should be that monetary policy is neither technocratic nor sinless, right? This is how it's been presented, that fiscal policy, yes, it would be good to use it, but there are so many problems associated with it that we have to just rely on monetary policy. And obviously, if you've lived in this world in the past 2-3 years, you know that it's not, without problems. Central bankers openly say that we are going to create unemployment in the process of fighting inflation. All you have to do is look at the equations in the new monetary consensus, and that's how it's supposed to work, right? You have to create slack in the economy, and if the slack is not that correlated with prices, then you have to create even more slack in the economy to achieve your reduction in inflation that you're trying to get. So how do you rethink it? Obviously, this is where the MMT perspective comes in. I would say based on MMT, we know that the sins of fiscal policy are obviously exaggerated, right? The linked debt to the grandchildren and so on and so forth. That's not a thing. So then, in view of all of this, we have to go back to tasking fiscal policy with full employment and price stability as well, not just the full employment part, but price stability. Obviously, Paulina has done a lot of work on that front. How do you do better kind of fiscal policy, right? How do we not fall back on the orthodox Keynesian pump priming approach? And I wanted to show you this chart, which you've probably seen a version of it somewhere, but it's from a short piece that I did for a German publication called A Tale of Two Recessions, where I just compared the recovery in employment between the COVID recession and the Great Recession. And obviously, the V-shaped recovery, which used to be only found in the economic history books, right? It's alive and well, and it's back. And we did it with fiscal policy, right? And obviously, with all the monetary stimulus that we did after the Great Recession, it took a long time for employment to recover, right? And importantly, the other thing that I looked at here was the tax revenues, right? And just to show that if you do proactive fiscal policy, because to say we need to rethink the framework, right? It's not sufficient to say we need to do fiscal policy. Question is, what kind of fiscal policy? How do you do it? I mean, probably giving a bunch of loans to a bunch of firms is not the best way to do fiscal policy, right? So we do need to think about that too. But what I wanted to show is that if you do proactive fiscal policy, then it's less costly, right? And it's less costly because your tax revenues are going to recover much, much quickly. So again, the blue line, or maybe it looks like black on your end, is the Great Recession. And the tax revenues are indexed to the beginning of the recession. So, and then you can see it falls during the recession, and after the Great Recession, it takes a long time for them to go back to their pre-recession levels, right? While with COVID, right, all the fiscal stimulus we did, and then look at what happens to your tax revenues, right? So this is the good way, in some sense, to do fiscal policy, but doing it more proactively and hence preventing a downfall in your economy and a downfall in your tax revenues, among other things. All right. I'm going to end here, and obviously happy to take any questions later.
so much for the presentation. And now we have Kyle Mohr from Bard College.
All right, thank you. So this talk again, for measuring labor market mismatch and the NAIRU. Hopefully we'll be generally on that. It might end up just a review of supply and demand. So apologies if that happens. This is also some kind of exploratory work, looking at how policymakers, especially at the Federal Reserve, have been trying to measure the labor market. And I think there's some interesting kind of tensions and paradoxes there that I'll consider here. So to start, kind of as Yeva mentioned, one of the frameworks, one of the things that has remained in the Fed's thinking is that the labor market is central to achieving their policy aims, how policy works for them. Some of you may recall about 25 years ago, our keynote speaker this afternoon wrote a piece calling this idea of an aggregate labor market a dangerous metaphor. So it was a fiction, right? This kind of neoclassical version, incompatible with a Keynesian perspective on employment, but it's still central to how the Fed thinks about their policy. So a few reasons for that. So one is it's crucial for achieving the dual mandate. So the maximum employment element, which is a new term instead of full employment, obviously has some relation with the labor market, but price stability too. So here's Powell from Wednesday, right, saying that to reduce inflation will require some softening of labor market conditions. So we need to have some understanding of what those conditions are, right, if they're going to reduce inflation. A lot of the discussion about how policy is supposed to work to meet these objectives too ties it to the labor market. So a year ago, you have Powell saying that our policies don't really do anything on the supply side. We don't have much control over that. What we can, or what we think we can, affect is the demand for labor. So something to slow down the economy, try and slow down inflation, we'll have to work on labor demand. You see, for both of these, it again sort of presupposes that aggregate labor market framework, which requires some attempt of measuring. If you want to try and forecast, get a sense of how well your policy will work, how much, how high interest rates need to go, whatever other factors, you need some way of measuring the labor market. And this led to sort of a big crisis for the Fed for a lot of the reasons Yeva talked about, is that after the financial crisis, that Phillips curve relation broke down. Right? So on the one hand, you might question whether the relationship is as theoretically robust as it was often presented. An alternative or an additional way to explore that is to see whether the measures of slack or tightness are misspecified in some sense, whether or not there's a lot more going on in the labor market that the measures like unemployment don't capture. So this, if you're again thinking about how you might measure this for policy, the first question you might want to answer is who or what is in the labor market. And then a second one is how well does the market work? Right? Work in the sense of sort of what a orthodox market is supposed to do, bring together buyers and sellers to complete transactions. In this case, bringing together firms looking to hire, people looking to work, and converting that in a sense, or forming new hires and new employment. This is an important determinant of the NAIRU, of the natural rate. Right? If the market itself is not functioning, it's not working efficiently, if there's some frictions or imperfections that are preventing supply and demand from generating new employment, there isn't, policy won't be as effective, right? Trying to influence the demand will run into those frictions, okay, and prevent you from lowering unemployment or boosting employment. Okay, so this measure of how well the market works goes into almost all the estimates of the natural rate, of the NAIRU, and as you know, that's one of the variables in the Fed's policy framework. And one of the questions that this brings up is what the relation is between the two of these. Okay? So what, if any, is the relation between who is in the labor market and how well it functions? And this became a key focus of the Fed basically over the 10 years of the recovery since the financial crisis, and is still very much there today. So if you were thinking about trying to measure the labor market and you're approaching it from this aggregate labor market perspective, the neoclassical view, one of the things that might strike you as odd initially is that we always have job openings that are vacant, firms looking to hire, and unemployed workers. And if you think about just the supply and demand cross, this would seem almost like a situation of both excess demand and excess supply. Firms, unfilled vacancies, workers that can't find employment. So I'm pretty sure you can't show that on the graph, excess supply and excess demand at the same time. And so this phenomenon was one of the big impetuses to start the search and matching tradition in labor economics, which is still very dominant. And it explains this apparent anomaly by attributing all kinds of frictions to the labor market, all kinds of various inefficiencies, imperfections. And you can really take your pick. There's kind of a whole grab bag of options there. Asymmetric, imperfect information, wage rigidities, geographic immobility, right? All kinds of options, all kinds of potential imperfections that would allow for this situation. And so one of the main things policymakers do to try and measure sort of these aggregate frictions, which again is something that's unobservable, is to estimate what's called a matching function. Okay? And so if this looks like an aggregate production function, that's exactly what it is in a sense. So what it's trying to say is how two inputs, in this case, some measure of labor supply, the U, unemployed workers, and vacancies, two inputs into the matching function work together to generate some output. And the output here are matches. You can think of that as new hires. So any month, any quarter, whatever we have the data for, we could estimate this function. And this should be giving us some indication of how efficient the labor market is. That A term serves the same role as the A in the aggregate production function. Okay, so some measure of technology, if we're talking about growth. In this case, estimating that A becomes the measure of the market's efficiency or inefficiency. And it's essentially the term you need to make sure the equality holds. Okay. We call that efficiency. If it's equal to 1, right, market's working very well. And what's often concluded from that is that there's no frictions, no imperfections. Okay. So we have this nice quote kind of explaining that. Okay. If the market works perfectly like the textbook model, and we all know it doesn't, including people doing the research, right? But we're using that as the benchmark to try and assess the amount of frictions in a sense. One of the problems, so going along with the breakdown in the Phillips curve and all this, is that after the financial crisis, this sort of broke down. So if you look back at this equation, what happened is unemployment shot up, hires are going down, and that means that your efficiency parameter is registering a higher and higher degree of inefficiency. That's a problem for policy though, because now if you're trying to impact labor demand and you're working in a more friction-filled world, I guess, more imperfect world, your policy will be less and less effective. In a sense, your measure of kind of where that natural rate is probably going up. And so that's kind of tough if you're a policymaker trying to work on and through the labor market, and the labor market isn't working. The market mechanism has fallen. So one option would be to say, kind of out of luck there. But there was another strand of research that says maybe we're measuring the inputs to that matching function wrong. Maybe we're not using the right measure of labor supply or labor demand, for that matter. And one way of trying to do that is to add a quantitative measure. So maybe there's just more people that are looking for work. Maybe unemployment undercounts the true state of slack in the labor market. Many people here probably all agree with that. But there's also a qualitative argument that was made. Maybe there's a breakdown in the market because the people in it have changed. And for whatever reason, that is causing some breakdown in this mechanism. Okay, so to their credit, there was a very robust examination, I suppose, of all kinds of different groups in the labor market, right, to try and suss out this relation. If we can find that the breakdown in matching efficiency is due to just different people, right, different types of workers on the labor supply side, that means the market is still functioning, right? The problem is on the inputs, workers in this case. If not, then we're a lot more limited in policy. So these are two Fed economists. One of their conclusions is that in recessions, the quality of employability of unemployed workers worsens, right? And so matching efficiency falls. Yeva talked about sort of circular reasoning, right? People who can't find jobs must therefore be less efficient at finding jobs, and so efficiency goes down. Very much so. Okay, so one way of trying to get at this is, okay, so who are all the different people we're going to put in this measure? And the standard way of doing this is using what I'm calling a classification or a participation approach. Who is in the labor market? And we usually do that based on responses in the current population survey in the US. Are you looking for work? Do you want a job? Have you worked in the past? There's all kinds of data collected. And we classify people as in, maybe 1 foot in, 1 foot out, some version of who's in the labor market. So to give an example of this, right, we count the number of people meeting some criteria. So the officially unemployed, could add involuntary part-time workers, those who are not in the labor force but say they want a job now. And you could think of all types of different criteria you might use to say, well, these people are probably in that labor supply measure. One of the interesting discrepancies, in a sense, between this is that no matter how you count people there, most new employment doesn't come from any of those groups. So if you look at the flows data, we can track people in the survey over time. Most new employment comes from people who were out of the labor market, said they didn't want a job, weren't looking for a job, but they show up as working the next month. So presumably you would want those people in your measure of labor supply. They're the people that actually transition into employment. Additionally, most vacancies are filled by workers going from one job to the next. Okay, so this isn't a net increase in employment, but if we're comparing vacancies on the one hand to some measure of labor supply, most vacancies are job-to-job transitions. And there's also a growing recognition here that when we're looking at this data, we want to take into account the jargon of economics we call heterogeneity. Right? There's lots of different types of people here, whether it's the duration of unemployment, whether demographic characteristics, all kinds of differences here. Right. So with all of this, right, what that basically shows is that there's no way to clearly demarcate who is in the labor market at any time. And so researchers at the Fed, these are all either were at the time or at one point were affiliated with the Federal Reserve, came up with all these different measures of the labor supply. And there's more examples, but I'll just highlight a few. So this measure in 2014 tried to come up with a labor supply measure with 9 different categories. So they broke up the unemployed into short-term and long-term, different types of not in labor force, retired, in school. The reason, again, all these people are in there is because some of them are employed every month. Okay, we have a finer refinement in 2018. Now we're going to do 16 different labor force categories, and we're going to include the employed because they fill a lot of jobs. Taking it again, maybe to a more extreme. So this was right on the eve of the pandemic. 22 different labor market groups that we're going to construct. Okay, 13 distinct categories of unemployment based on how long you've been unemployed, based on the industry you've been in, right? You can chop this basically as finely as you want. What, these two latter measures have though, is that every single person in the civilian non-institutional population is in the labor supply measure now. So almost 270 million people. If you throw that into your matching function, sorry, your efficiency is going to collapse, right? Because you just shot your U measure up tremendously. It's probably not a great target for policy that we want to have everyone employed, right? We want some match there. But again, there's no clear demarcation of who's participating and who's not. So how do you try and make sense out of this? Okay, well, we need to have some weighting system. Right? We'll count people in these different categories more or less. We know it can't be everyone in the economy, but we know there's no clear criteria to demarcate that. So you need a common measure that you can weight all these different groups by. And the solution, which undermines the whole exercise in a sense, is to use search efficiency weights. And so what that is a measure of the likelihood of each group to transition into employment. Okay, so go through that a little bit. So this is from that first measure there of the 9 different groups. Say short-term unemployed workers have the highest likelihood of transitioning into employment historically. So we'll count them as a full person. The long-term unemployed transition at about half that rate. So they're less likely to transition into employment. Okay. Their search efficiency is therefore about half those of the short-term unemployed. So we'll count them, we'll give them a weight of 0.51. And you can go down and down. So the people that are out of the labor force and want a job, they transition at slightly lower rates, so we'll weight them lower. Okay, on to the those in school, disabled workers, retired workers. Okay, so basically, if you're in a group that historically has a lower transition rate into employment, we'll reduce your weight. And you can do that with the employed population, right? No matter how finely you slice this, right? In theory, everyone's unique, we're all special, right? We could each have our own criteria. You could make tons and tons of categories. What does that do to your measure of efficiency? Right? Remember, one of the challenges here was that if efficiency is breaking down, the market no longer works, right? And we need a market to conduct our policy. Well, this weighting system brings the market right back and makes it work super efficiently because you're essentially getting closer and closer to this identity, right? Of counting your labor supply measure based on the likelihood they get a job. And so the sort of more finely you refine that measure, the closer and closer this becomes to an identity, and that A-term approach is one. Okay? We're back at a very efficient labor market where the people who don't get jobs, and the people that are efficient searchers find jobs. Right? So the more productive inputs, right, the market works, the least productive it doesn't. So again, reduces our measure of matching efficiency. Now, funny enough, this should reduce our measure of the NAIRU and the natural rate, right, for these different groups. So it's an interesting tension there. So puts the Fed in kind of this interesting, or just researchers in general, perspective. Using this aggregate labor market view, right? If we use the narrow measures of labor supply, the market breaks down. If we use the search efficiency weighted measures, the market comes back together, it works perfectly. And also in a sense, we don't need as much policy because it's the most efficient or increasingly efficient way up. So Yeva talked about circularity in terms of inflation expectations, national inflation. I think you have a similar thing here, but it does, to tie back to Jamie Galbraith's idea that this aggregate labor market is kind of a dangerous fiction. It points to some of the way Fed researchers are maybe almost finding that themselves when they try to measure it. One of the critiques there is the labor supply notion, right? And they're increasingly finding that there's sort of no way to actually measure that in a way that makes any sense. So this, we saw again at the pandemic, there was a big fear that labor market mismatch, so that's sort of another word for inefficiency, had increased tremendously. And as a result of that, you had all kinds of advice, I suppose, about how this was going to require more and more unemployment to bring vacancies down to try and back to that that natural rate. And I might not do the beverage curve. I don't know how we're doing on time. But so 5 minutes. Okay. So the part I guess that I'm most interested in is sort of this tension here. Okay? That you have to either use the narrow measure and the market breaks down, or the weighted measure and it's still there. And that the Fed can't identify sort of the relevant labor supply to put into any of its models or to use for policy assessment. So I think I'm going to end there, and then if you want to talk about the beverage curve, we can after, which is the graphical version of all this.
All right. Hi, everyone. Nice to see you all. So I've been trying to think for a while how to get the job guarantee to the next sort of stage of political advocacy. We've had people in Congress who put their hands up. We've got a kind of clear statement of what I consider to be a relatively progressive framing of it in the Ayanna Pressley job guarantee resolution. But when it comes to kind of building stakeholder support, if you look around the world, there are places now that have at least had a chance to engage with the job guarantee for whom concerns around labor and labor interests remain a sticking point. You can see this with certain labor luminaries in the United States, people like, I would say, the late, great Bill Spriggs, who, was somewhat supportive of job guarantee, but still quite skeptical in some ways. You could see it at the moment when Corbyn takes power in the UK, and obviously there were certain advisors in that moment who were very skeptical of MMT for personal reasons, but also that moment when they were crafting their agenda of what was sort of supposed to be the most pro-labor agenda of a generation in the UK. The job guarantee was notably absent there. In my country, in Australia, you're also seeing a labour movement, Labour Party there now in power talking about the job guarantee, but still lukewarm on it. So the question I've been trying to understand is why, when this seems so obvious to some of us that this is a pro-working class policy, there's still resistance and objection, and what would it take to really get over that or to recraft a vision of the job guarantee? So, not to kind of spend too much time on the point, because this is a room that hopefully is pretty familiar with this, but at least from a kind of MMT point of view, we can look at the idea of a job guarantee as a macroeconomic stabilizer. I'll get back to the nuances of that, but there are other traditions of the job guarantee as well, right? We might want to be the only ones can define what that is, but there's a long human rights tradition. There's a long tradition of looking at the ways in which a job guarantee could be part of a larger workforce development policy, and the broader concept that John Powell came up with of what they call targeted universalism, right? Coming up with universal policies that have a disproportionate impact on certain communities is why I think you see groups like civil rights movements, racial justice leaders, and others centering a job guarantee in their own conception of economic justice. It doesn't make it a black issue, but it does mean it disproportionately affects those who are already marginalized. That includes groups that don't make it their primary target now, but for example, in the trans population in the United States, unemployment numbers are 30, 40, 50%. So this has a disproportionate benefit to a lot of groups, even ones who don't have a large publicly known tradition like the civil rights movement. When we get to the job guarantee, we can think of the macro stabilizing framework that MMT or proposal MMT talks about as, I think, having two components, right? One is lifting up the floor. Right now, the effective minimum wage is 0. I think this is a very powerful framework. I think the idea that a job guarantee sets a base standard for people who want to work. But the other side of it is that pull side. When you start to have, at least in theory, inflation in the labor market, the fixed nature of the job guarantee wage is supposed to exert essentially a downwards pressure or a downwards anchor gravity, so that you don't end up with the sort of conceptual risk of a wage price spiral or some sort of destabilization of wages going upwards. I think that's an important thing to come back to when we look at, why labor might not like the job guarantee or be concerned about some of the ways that we've framed and presented the job guarantee. One of the other things to look at is the idea of a job guarantee is also providing a framework for labor organizing where we have a single conception of the labor market or of the working class, right? The idea that today, even unions are often not taking responsibility for the unemployed to the extent that there are individual trade unions in individual sectors. These sort of general unemployed don't really have the same voice. There are a couple of colleagues of mine in Australia who created an unemployed workers union, which I thought was an interesting concept. But the fact that that's sort of unique almost or unusual shows that the normal standard is unions consider their industry, their workers to be their priority, and the kind of general unemployed are left to fend for themselves. You can almost go back to Marx and the lumpen proletariat as its own category as an example of the kind of remainder that doesn't really have a voice or have a champion. There's also the kind of idea that we need to think about higher education. We need to think about the development of an educated, literate, skilled population as necessarily requiring a job guarantee. So Tracy McMillan Cottom has written about this, the idea that if you don't know where you're going, you'll end up somewhere else. If you're building a higher education system with the idea that it's supposed to produce workers, but there's no conception of the workforce on the back end, you end up with the neoliberalized university where it's up to private employers to dictate what learning is and isn't. And that's why we have these hyper-inflated business schools and underfunding of real learning and all that kind of crap. And then the other broader conception, I think, is the idea of immigrant justice, the idea of open borders, right? We're seeing around the world right now questions about mass migration in places where there's a land border. We're seeing questions of climate refugees, etc. And increasingly, the geopolitics of the future are going to be the geopolitics of huge numbers of displaced people coming to the borders of other countries, and the question of whether those countries go, it is our responsibility to look after these people, or we need to protect what we have. Let's build bigger walls. Let's build automated guns to shoot them if they get too close to our limited resources. So the question of a job guarantee being framed as the greatest resource we have is always going to be people, and we want more people. And we can always accommodate more people in a system that can turn more people into even more output, productivity, whatever else, is, I think, a question of how we deal with the geopolitics of the nation state in the world of climate. You have this idea that there is also a kind of opposition to a job guarantee rooted in a class politics. Marx saying, if you have full employment, it's going to reduce the ability of capitalists to discipline labor. You have Koleski saying even if it is profitable for businesses, even if they would benefit in the short term, they understand that they would lose in the real politics, zero-sum game of political power. And then nowadays you have the new Keynesian idea that we need to balance price stability on the backs of the unemployed, because if you reduce unemployment in a way that increases worker power, you don't have any way to discipline that wage price spiral that lives in the back of our heads. And you do have this kind of labor opposition that I think is, while there are some valid critiques or some valid concerns that I'm going to go into, you also have what I consider to be some bad faith bullshit. First of all is the idea that there's not possible to conceive of good jobs. If there were things to be done, we would have already funded them with regular jobs, so there must be nothing left to do, right? The idea that you could have a category called good to do but not necessary is like too far to think, apparently. So you get these kind of bad faith critiques that anything trying to go beyond our traditional conception of active labor market policy is necessarily hot air. There's nothing good there. The other concern is that it could undermine existing good jobs and wages, right? It took us a really long time to get to the point where nurses are earning $65,000 a year. If you're offering to let job guarantee healthcare workers into hospitals at $15 an hour, you might as well just shoot the labor movement in the foot right now. And then lastly, I think there is something to this, and something we should probably be a little more circumspect or honest in, which is if we are going to conceptualize a job guarantee as a symmetric price anchor, we are simultaneously on one hand saying we're empowering labor, and on the other hand saying there are going to be some circumstances where we're going to be siding on the other side of the table from labor. We're going to be saying your wage demands are too high, or that to the extent that you want to keep pushing upwards, it is creating the exact ratcheting effect we are trying to limit. I think more broadly, and this is just based on anecdotal experience, I think there are political objections coming from labor movement organizers that reflect a tradition of political advocacy. First of all, we shouldn't be fighting for rights. Rights is such a liberal concept, right? A human right to this, an educational right to that. What we need is people in the streets. We need bodies, we need strikes, we need protests. And anything that smacks of like a stable equilibrium of legal rights is sort of missing how politics really works. And then secondly, do we really want to be thinking that the future of social progress or economic benefits come with state institutions? Shouldn't we be trying to empower unions themselves? Every time we have a job guarantee is a day we are going to the state to solve our problems rather than our union. And I don't think that these are intrinsic critiques, but they are, I think, the way that a lot of labor activists come to the job guarantee and then feel instinctively a little skeptical or a little bit suspicious. I think there are reasons not to take a lot of that seriously. First of all, I have yet to meet a labor advocate who opposes the job guarantee who has come up with an actual answer to the question of what do you do for the unemployed people who can't get an active labor market job, right? There is a sort of negotiation downwards of the goals, right? There is a soft bigotry of low expectations that comes with this particular vision. I think it's also a pretty cheap critique to take certain models or certain design approaches and then to equate them with the concept more broadly. You know, I went to a bad public school once, must be that we shouldn't educate children. Now, it's not a very persuasive critique when you stop and look at it, but it sounds persuasive when you say, well, unless you have answered every design problem, I am not going to be supportive of this concept, rather than it's also my job to think about those design problems with you. I think it also misunderstands a rights-based approach, right? It is not surprising to me that most of the labor advocates that I see making these cases are not lawyers, but also when you actually look at a lot of the benefits that labor movements do want, they are rights, not rights in a necessarily FDR, UNDHR human rights perspective, but they are legal entitlements. You have a right to be free from harassment in your workplace. You have a right to clean, working conditions. These are things that are labor goals, labor policies, right? Labor demands, but the way they actually manifest is through a recognition of a property interest or a legal entitlement or a right to claim or to sue or to get a judgment. So from a lawyer's perspective, rights don't have to mean human rights strategies. They can just mean anything that can be legally enforceable. And then I think on the state-based focus, again, it also misunderstands the idea that anything that goes through public institutions must be necessarily at the expense of labor or labor institutions, right? Nobody, I think, as far as I know, in most places where I'm having these debates with English speakers anyway, do people say that the best way to provide healthcare is through your union rather than through public healthcare? So when it comes, or public schools should be entirely run by unions, etc. So when it comes to other forms of social benefits, unions are quite comfortable using state institutions as the framework. It's just that this again becomes that one sticking point where they get to say, you're relying on the state jobs office rather than the union hall, and we don't like that, rather than being creative about how those two institutions could be interacting with each other. And then lastly, I think the critique is also unfair because it's essentially ahistorical. It's denying the long history of labor movements that have pushed for these kinds of things, especially in the 40s and 60s and 70s. But even at the International Labour Organization now and things, there is this at least nominal commitment to a conception of full employment. And there are other labor movements around the world that have embraced, at least to some degree, the concept of a job guarantee who get erased in these narratives that are presented as somehow oppositional or outside the labor movement. So my view is if you try to peek underneath the hood of this critique, if you try to kind of get to its root, first of all, a lot of it is coming from existing prominent voices in labor. You go to a room of a bunch of union workers and you make a case for a job guarantee, I think you're probably getting a pretty high number in that room supportive of it. So often it's the sort of intelligentsia, it's the elites, it's the union leaders, it's the sort of economic advisors to the union movement or to pro-labor political parties who have the greatest objections. And they get to speak with a voice of labor. They get to say, oh, on behalf of labor, I don't like this. And now, therefore, this is an anti-labor thing. And I think it's important to problematize or at least scrutinize the degree of agency they have to speak on behalf of those movements with those kinds of critiques. The second thing is I think they are structurally always going to have an incentive to prioritize existing workers over the unemployed, right? Just from a pure kind of institutional perspective, they're the ones who are funding the thing, they're the bread and butter. You piss them off, you lose the election, you piss off unemployed people, doesn't affect your job prospects. So if you're talking about individuals for whom maintaining the support of their base is important, they see their base as preserving existing labor interests rather than expanding the pie of potential stakeholders in the labor movement. And the same is true of existing high wages, right? If you don't somehow solve the problem of the effective minimum wage being zero this year, no one's going to complain. But if you let a hard-won contract from last year get undermined, someone is going to complain. And I think that creates an asymmetry of pressure to deliver certain results or at least protect certain wins over achieving others. And lastly, it's easier to prefer the devil you know. If you've grown up in a labor movement where your tactics and your strategies have been sectorally focused, have been focused on direct action in the context of contract renegotiations your entire life, and somebody suggests that the way to move forward with the labor movement is to adopt an entirely different framework, an entirely different set of tactics, the instinctual response is going to be, wait, I've still got something to add. My approach still has some value. I don't want to go back to being a baby and have to work my way up this entirely different political approach. So I think there are reasons why psychologically you can look at labor leaders or labor experts and understand why they're going to have some objections to a job guarantee even before you get to the substance. That said, now I've criticized them and said they're all full of shit. Now I'm going to try to give them a little bit of credit, which is, first of all, I think from at least within the various job guarantee traditions, from the MMT perspective, the framing of a job guarantee as a macro stabilizer cuts both ways. And there has to be, I think, some recognition of the political cost of trying to play a rhetorical move that cuts both ways. I think a lot of the people in that community, I don't want to speak for anybody, but I think a lot of people in the MMT community would probably be pretty much on the side of the working class every chance they get. But to the extent that looking at NAIRU and saying we're going to replace that with something else that is going to achieve a similar price stabilizing function that we currently use the reserve army of the unemployed for, but replacing with a reserve army of the employed, that word reserve is still there. You know, that disciplining function on the way up is still there. And we shouldn't assume that labor advocates are so stupid as not to hear that strain of the tone of what we are arguing. Right? If we say, hey, if there's too high wage demands, we'll keep them down. That's exactly the kind of thing a labor activist should be skeptical and suspicious of, frankly. So thinking about what that means as we craft our narratives, or to the extent that that has always been a rhetorical ploy to get us past NAIRU, maybe the time is now to acknowledge that and jettison it, or at least start coming up with a second layer of that framing so that we don't get instinctually revulsed by the people who we are claiming to be on the same side in solidarity with. Second thing is, whatever we might think of the merits of that strategy or the merits of our framing, I think if we are honest with ourselves, we need to look at the degree of labor penetration we've achieved with our political strategy and accept that we should be doing better, right? If I'm giving ourselves a report card, it's not an F, but it's probably a C-. Like, we should be better about having penetration here. We should be getting more activists within the union movement excited about this. And I have seen it work, and I know a lot of us work behind the scenes, so it could be that the iceberg of union support is larger than it looks like on the surface. But it needs to look on the surface pretty good. It needs to look better than it is. It needs to be the kind of thing that you should see on the front page of the ILO and the AFL-CIO, etc. That should be a conscious prioritization of our messaging and media strategy. If not by everybody, at least by one wing. And lastly, I think it is difficult to have these kinds of debates when there are certain sort of bad faith messengers. It's very hard to take a critique by Joe Mitchell or see, I've forgotten his bloody name, the Labour advisor in the UK.
James Medway.
Thank you. Of course you know who I'm talking about. James Medway, right? It's hard to take critiques by people like that seriously when you really just need to punch them in the face first and get that out of your system and then take seriously what they have to say. But the point is, just because there are bad faith messengers doesn't mean everything they have to say is bullshit, right? We have to be honest about the fact that even if we don't want to hear it from those people on their terms, that they're not saying things that are completely untrue. So what should we want? I think we should want a movement that is trying to bring in those concerns, right? We should be able to take what are framed as categorical opposition critiques and turn them into a dialectic critique that allows us to improve our own strategy and our own model design. I think the win condition is not that we are going to address these tensions, because some of them are fundamental, but that we could turn them into job guarantee critiques, right? Different models of the job guarantee. There was a point where I think I said 10 years ago, if we got to the point where the left was debating a job guarantee or a UBI, we've already won. I reckon we kind of got actually pretty close to that, and now we get to upgrade what our win condition is and say, no, we still actually want the job guarantee, not the UBI. But in this context, getting to the point where this isn't framed as should we have a job guarantee or not, but we all agree that there is a thing called a job guarantee. Now we are haggling over the details. All right, now we are haggling over the opposition, and whatever parts of our own preferences are above on that, are sort of the premium of our preferred vision. We should separate that fight with the fight about getting to a consensus of some conception of a job guarantee, right? Maybe we prefer a single base wage. Maybe we prefer lifting the floor first. Maybe we prefer separating union issues from basic macro issues. But that's our preference. That's not what's going to get us to a coalition that puts these issues within it, rather than at the boundary. And lastly, I think working out what it means to have JG experts who themselves have credible union commitments, right? There are people that work with unions, even in this room, etc. I know that, but I, again, don't think if you look at the community, you would say that it looks like the same kinds of people that are advising the union movement, you know, whether it's the Dean Bakers and CEPA of the world or the EPIs of the world. They have an instinctual brand that is a lot more loyal or affiliated with the union movement. I think we need to work out what our own strategy of getting somewhere similar looks like. Last few minutes is this paper that it was my first ever research paper in undergrad that I'm finally kind of bringing back. It's a nice sort of coming home moment for myself. But that was before I was really getting into a lot of the MMT stuff, and it was looking at incomes policies, right? Examples where you engage in wage restraint in exchange for social wage increases, things like time off and holiday pay and sick pay and all that kind of stuff. And looking at ways in which incomes policies affect the macro strategies in general of a country, especially ones where there's already a pro-Labor bent. So the comparison that I did was of the UK and Australia. In the UK in the 1970s, you had a Labor government in power. You had a strong Labor movement. You had a centralized peak body Labor advocacy entity called the Trades Unions Congress. And you had a high degree of inflation, largely driven by the oil price shocks earlier in the 70s. In Australia, you had the Accord in the 80s. This was their version of the social contract. Once again, you had a Labor government in power. The Prime Minister was the former head of the peak body trade union organization. It was at a time when most of the other governments in the world that they were close to were turning hard right. So you had Thatcher, you had Reagan, you had Helmut Kohl, but in Australia you had a centre-left Labor government stay in power from 1980 to about 1996. So it was a weird moment where Australia was a sort of little bastion of Labourism when everybody else was going the other way. And you also had a relatively high degree of inflation there. Australia also had a pretty centralized, strong peak body movement, but unlike in the UK, where the peak body's job was really just to kind of coordinate at the trade union level, different sectoral bargaining. It was basically a Congress made up of the individual leaders of each individual union. In Australia, it was structured slightly differently. There was a kind of technocratic bureaucracy at the top of the Labor movement. And the reason for that was because in 1901, when we were federated, we created a tripartite industrial relations commission where the government, Labor and business would essentially submit a big set of bids of what they thought all the wages and price increases should be for the upcoming year. And this independent commission would kind of work it out. You know, we're going to resolve capital, labor, and government disputes through thank you, technocratic engagement. The effect of that was that the peak body union in Australia had to submit very complex system-wide visions for macroeconomic stabilisation in a way that in the UK, they didn't really have to do that. It was much more direct democracy. So you had situations where individual union leaders in the UK would go to the Labor government and say, I know we need wage restraint, but I'm going to get kicked out of my job if I do that. So I'm sorry, I'm going to have to call you, you know, crappy while understanding that you had valid macroeconomic reasons for wanting this wage restraint. And now there are economists in the room, maybe people who know the history better than I do, can question whether the wage price spiral concerns at the time were an actually genuine thing to be worried about. And I think the MMT position is it's usually not the wage price spiral driving the inflation. If anything, it's just reflecting underlying drivers of inflation and ensuring that labor doesn't eat the biscuit. But the effect in those periods was that the Labor government was going to the unions and saying, we are going to lose power. We are going to hand the government over to the right wing unless we get this under control in a way that's acceptable to the rest of society. So you have to work with us. You have to work with us to keep the cap on those wage levels. And we'll give you these other social benefits, but we want you to do it. So there were a lot of similarities between the two of them, but very different outcomes. In the UK, they essentially failed. It lasted for about 2 years effectively and then was undermined by the late 78, 79, leading to the famous winter of discontent, the big strikes, and then Thatcher takes over. So the Labour movement arguably gets itself over a cliff, and the end result is 25 years of conservative ideology. In Australia, it's almost the opposite. You win, you lose by winning. They did successfully constrain wages. They constrained striking. They said, when we make our collective centralized decisions, you individual shop stewards can't undermine that, and we will take away your right to strike. And you saw a kind of death by 1,000 cuts of labor militancy over the 80s and 90s. Right? The rest of the world, neoliberalism comes in from the right, in Australia it comes in from the left. So these differences manifest to a degree also in blue and white collar unionism. Right? For the idea of wage increases, saying we're going to do it at 5% helps if you've already got a pretty high wage. If you're saying you're going to do an increase of a flat £6 across the board, helps if your current income is £5 an hour. So differences in how we exercise wage restraint were playing out class differences within the labour movement, and the question to which kinds of parts of the labour movement had to bear the primary hit in these moments was the politics of the incomes policies. Sorry, I know I'm a little bit over really quick. Substantive implications, right? There needs to be a dialogue with unions. We need to take seriously their internal interests and internal structures as we develop our own vision of the job guarantee. The blue and white collar tensions, right? Whether lifting the floor or preserving that hierarchy of existing wage indexes is the priority, is a real tension and can undermine a broader labour support for a job guarantee unless we understand that as a tension we should be navigating within the guarantee act. Not saying unless you're pro blue collar, there's no way to support a job guarantee. We need to be thinking about different models that would be addressing different groups' interests so they can always come to the table with their own preferred version of a job guarantee that we can then work out a negotiated compromise between. And lastly, credible wage restraint at the upper level is hard, and I don't know if we even want it. I certainly don't know if I would want the working class to say they need it. But we have to be really kind of honest with ourselves of what we're saying there. If we're saying it's good to lift the floor, great. If we're saying there'll be moments when we are going to compress the ceiling, we need to be really thoughtful about what that political moment is going to look like. Even if you have a pro-Labor government, even if you have a strong union movement, the macroeconomic moment when that happens could be fatal to what we are trying to do. So there's a lot of dimensions to pro-Labor policy. There's a lot of internal class tensions to job guarantee design. We need to think about these effects in our framing, and we need to be thinking about how to move beyond our preferred vision of this stuff to a vision that's actually going to bring the people in who haven't been brought in yet. Phil Harvey's a place to start. I think looking at some of the wage tiering visions of a job guarantee is at least a way to acknowledge there are people for whom the $15 base wage vision or $20 or whatever it is going to have no interest to them. Their sectors, their industries, they're past that level. They're not going to be interested in a version that doesn't have anything for them. looking at Minsky saying once we've got tight full employment, the next step is workforce development. So we need to be thinking about the kind of skilled side of the pool of it all at the same time. And lastly, what do we really mean when we say price anchor? Thank you.
I think we heard how the Fed doesn't know what they're doing, but their solution is still to try and create unemployment. That they also unemployment also something that we don't really know how to measure. And then Ro, you have the job guarantee and like the idea of like what if we like think about how to create employment, but then you're bringing this additional challenge of like the tensions even within labor movement on supporting that idea in that transition. And before we take questions, I think I will use my moderator privilege to ask for the first question as a former union technocrat.
Yeah.
And like a bit of a comment there too on, I think a lot of your presentation is very specific to Anglo-Saxon unions.
Yes.
And maybe that should be kind of stated clearly.
Yeah.
And it's also sort of like something I would consider is like the very strong history of decades of anti-communism in the union movement and something they fought. And how like you can see the leftovers on the hesitancy that they have with wanting state-run things. And there's like something there that's like a leftover. And then for developing countries, it's often the distrust in the state, where it's also sort of like the weak states that were left over after decades of structural adjustment became states that a lot of like unions don't trust. So I think the question, I guess, when we get to the answer is also like, what is the role you see for unions in a job guarantee work? Like, do you think that like those workers would be unionized and union members, and like how would that work out so like everyone wins? And now, before you answer, let's take a couple of other questions. Over here.
I have a question directed at the job guarantee talk. I come from Austria, which has a very corporatist system of social partnership, and at the at the state level union, they have like some kind of rule that was implemented, I think, 30 years ago, that like leads their wage, what they demand, and that's like the rolling inflation of the last year plus like long-term productivity like development. And all the people that researched that over like the last years found out that it was never met, even though it's a very most of the time conservative approach, because you always take in the past inflation, and they argue that therefore that doesn't lead to wage price spirals. And like when listening to the talk, what like my mind, like what I came up with is that I just had the impression that the whole talk about ceilings to wages and the anchoring, if you like believe in the whole framework, it makes a lot of sense, but at the same time it sounds to me as if it's coming at a totally wrong moment in time, where most unions have troubles with keeping real wages even like up, not even like rising real wages, but rather like tendencies of like defeat for many years. So my impression was just that maybe this importance, I'm not fully convinced of like the whole framework in general, but even if it's like in this framework, maybe this importance is important at another moment in history, but not like what most countries, like, or at least the Central Europe, what I'm talking about, have not experienced in the last decades.
Yeah, it's going to be similar to Miriam's questions. It's also for Rohan. First, I would say I think there's the same issue here as in Central Europe. So we're nowhere near wages being too high. I do think just hearing about the jobs guarantee from this angle, I do think that there's a fundamental trust issue between MMT policymakers, people who want to be making policy, and the labor movement. And there are two things. So one, I think, I wonder if this framing of, oh, in unions, there's already these fundamental tensions between the interests of the employed and the unemployed. I don't think that's so true. I think labor is a lot, as somebody who is in the labor movement myself, workers are a lot smarter and a lot more aware of the need for solidarity and their collective interests than is often framed. And I think coming in and framing the jobs guarantee as something that the employee need to understand why it might kind of be in their interest or something, and they just need to get over the tensions between themselves and the unemployed is false framing, a little bit patronizing, and a way to create a lot of distrust from within labor. So I don't mean that to be too harsh, but I think the job guarantee will not be supported by people within the labor movement. And I'm not talking about technocratic leaders, which I think is also a problem on the policymaking side, and can't just be framed as a union issue. I think in terms of developing trust from within the labor movement, this framing and this view of what workers actually think needs to be unpacked.
Let's take one more question and maybe try and keep it short, and then also keep the answer short so we can come back.
Yes, I think, the national constituency for the job guarantee is not in terms in the United States, certainly, let's say craft unions or the sort of the existing power structure of the AFL-CIO. And I think that your constituency is probably going to be mostly among workers, care workers, people who are either very much underpaid, or also entrepreneurs, social entrepreneurs who want to do things that a job guarantee would directly support. They would be overjoyed, or agencies that are trying to expand their care offerings. So I think this is often the sale made for a job guarantee is about exactly creating these jobs, and that's sort of a big social benefit for everybody to have that there. And those would, I think the labor movement could come along if you organize those people, or if you had those people advocating for those segments of the workforce, and also for those enterprises essentially, or whatever, nonprofits, whatever they are, that are going to be using a job guarantee or might be using a job guarantee workforce. So without that, I think there needs to be a multifarious movement. So the labor, I don't see the current, at least in the United States, the current labor movement being the spearhead of a job guarantee. At least that's my perception of their focus.
Can you try and answer?
Yeah.
Minutes?
First of all, I think that's exactly what I'm trying to contest, right? If our vision of this is one where the natural constituency doesn't include the AFL-CIO, it's not going to work. We need to expand whatever our conception is so that it does, or at least that there's this other thing. We often talk about, okay, there's regular jobs and then there's the JG as a reservoir. And I understand that there's a design mechanism, right? But it's also not like the regular jobs matter. If we're talking about the Green New Deal, they want those jobs to be the ones that matter. Care workers do have wage negotiations. They do have union contracts. So I think it isn't going to be something we can, yeah, I know, but I'm saying, I think we can't separate those two parts of what we conceptualize for like the latest system. First of all, I don't want to give the impression that I think the average rank and file don't support this. So I apologize if I get that impression. I don't mean to be patronizing. I do think you've got to speak to average union organizers. They do like the job guarantee. What I'm mostly talking about is the prioritization of policy strategy at the union structural level. I don't see the job guarantee as a top 5 demand on any of the major unions in the country, right? Like I know a couple of individual small unions that have made that a priority, but it's a number I can count on a few hands. So I think when it comes to what people support and then what gets prioritized with resource allocation and strategic sort of campaigning, there's a divergence there. And that's exactly what I'm trying to get at is I actually think we have a lot more support as a labor policy than would be represented by how many labor leaders are devoting resources to campaign for it. So I don't mean to give the impression at all. I think it's a problem with worker solidarity or them understanding it's sort of the reason it's so popular across ideologies is precisely because it's so naturally intuitive to people that's pro-worker. The question of Austria, I think you're exactly right, and this is almost, maybe I wasn't clear about it, kind of what I'm trying to get at, which is we, I think, are coming from a world where fighting the NAIRU, fighting this macroeconomic stabilization, we want to show that we can do something that is stabilizing on both sides. But the reality is, that's never the problem. The upper level is never the problem. But when we frame it that way, what we are telling everybody is, hey, we're going to support you, but also potentially cut you down. And they hear that, even if that's a never going to happen scenario, they hear that we are designing this explicitly to pincer in wage increase potential. And I think that is something that gets a bit of anxiety, perhaps reasonably, is kind of my provocative suggestion to my own internal community here. Lara, last question, your point here. I think thank you for the context, right? I think anti-communism is something I haven't thought about enough. So that is something I'll try and think about. Although I will say, in at least Australian context, the Labor left, there are plenty of commie sympathetic friends of mine who are still job guarantee sympathetic for some set of reasons. So it could be that tendency has filtered through in those contexts. But I do see something where there are people who are quite comfortable with state ownership in general. Like even the Midways of the world are comfortable with owning half of the economy. They just don't want to try to do that for some reason with the labor relation itself. They don't want to socialize that. They want to leave that as almost a market thing. And then I guess the state skepticism, centrism in developing countries, you're right. This is a very Anglo-centric framing. So I should have been clear about that. I think we can make a case for positive state institutions in those places, and the fact that we would say that for schools and hospitals, but maybe draw a line here is something to unpack a little bit more. But yeah, I think you're right. It's mostly an Anglo phenomenon.
Oh, Lena, it's a comment.
I mean, it is a comment. I mean, I do want to challenge you a little bit on this. You know, the point that we need to engage the unions, well taken, and I absolutely agree. To the extent that we've done that in the past few years, we have had the AFL-CIO on board. Damon Silver is participating in our job guarantee panels, publicly endorsing it. Service unions are on. My experience is more what you said earlier, that we get together, we talk about the impact of the job guarantee on the labor movement, that folks from the labor movement see that their work becomes easier in a context of full employment, that it is enabling, like when conditions are full. So actually we are more aligned, but they say, listen, this is my focus, it's sectoral bargaining. It's not the purview of my policy work. So that is more, I mean, there has been some dissent and worry, I think, you know, folks who are worried about maybe public sector work that might be somehow undermined through the job guarantee, which I think is such an academic exercise. Like if you see how it's done, even in the Anglo-Saxon world, where you have like job guarantee programs, it's work. People are mobilizing to think how to address social needs services. It doesn't really come in contact or conflict with traditional public service in places that have robust public service, like France, like Austria. So I think that there is something missing in there. And on the question of wage suppression, you know, I want to push it back a little bit on this, because it's true that we have colleagues who talk about the reserve army of employed. And this is an academic exercise, because what's the alternative? I mean, we're in capitalism. We live in a capitalist economy. So maybe it is unpalatable to use the word, and maybe we should use a better word. But the bottom line is that we are actually providing meaningful living wage employment as the only alternative to the current paradigm of right of existing. So I think framing is a point very well taken, but I don't think anyone has argued for wage suppression. Like we've talked about how to make sure it's not inflationary. And I think we all recognize that these are genuine concerns for everybody, that we want to keep up with wage demands, want to be able to raise the standard of living of working class. But at the same time, we understand how devastating actually inflation is to the labor project. So it's that kind of tension. I think we've been
and the lesson is the labor movement hasn't worked out that tension either. When you get a strong labor movement, a strong labor government, and inflation, it's a hard problem. So the point taken about the AFL-CIO, part of this is I'm saying a lot of this stuff is happening under the surface. So getting it to the surface is going to be important for the PR strategy. To your point about the jobs, not like we're lifting up jobs in general. Where does it hit on the public sector? I think the rubber hits the road a little bit on this with the Green New Deal, because there was this moment where it was like, we're going to have a just transition. We're going to have good paying jobs. And the number of carbon workers is very small anyway. But this idea that we are not going to put people in a lower quality of work than they already had, that excludes almost by definition a lot of people who are currently in sectors that are earning above what the job guarantee wage, and we can say, yes, there's public sector employment, we support that, but I think rhetorically they hear that as a different priority for us. You know what I mean? Like, yes, go do that. Yes, public employment, do as much of that as you want. And then we'll come into the conversation and have a thing to say. And I think I think that deprioritization of main public employment at the expense of this, the reservoir, I don't think we need that dichotomy. You know what I mean? I'm not saying you necessarily do it, but I think that's the moment where, when I'm looking at Green New Deal when it's happening, where we fit that reservoir into the rest of the job structure, it wasn't gelled enough, I think, kind of in lifetime.
Let's take a couple more questions. Nathan?
Yeah, the other thing this is more of a comment than a question, but fatal sin. But on precisely on that issue, I think another thing is that there is already a government wage scale. Like, there's a government wage scale that's very kind of designed. It's got tiers where you move up the tiers. We already have that structure for administering the wages, a very set tier that you hit certain qualifications, you crawl up. And there's no reason why, like, the base job guarantee can't be the bottom, the floor tier in that wage scale, and then you have, you possibly have people who can be hired at those higher tiers, hit qualifying events. And one of the key things that does is it deals with the problem of underfunding of agencies, where agencies have these fixed annual appropriations that are all being starved. If you do we're administering the wage scale, we're administering to the tiers, and you can get more hiring at those agencies at that tiers, it both solves a problem in terms of the functioning of the administrative state, and also does the thing that you're talking about in terms of the tier. So it's like the thing you're talking about having a tiered job guarantee, we already have the structure for that, for most of that, and the flexibility helps solve other problems we're trying to solve. So
I think what Fadel and others have shown with their model. Sorry.
Let's also take other questions from other people.
Yes, this is for
And
the
then-
paper on monetary policy. And this might have been referred to yesterday, because I know there was a lot of talk on finance. But discussing, I think it's important when you're discussing, of course, the Fed monetary policy is the changing nature, the growing financialization of the US economy. And you talk about, for example, that, interest rate policies don't really affect investment. It's like, yeah, because they're interested in higher returns that they can earn in the financial market, as opposed to lower rates of return they would earn invested in long-term productive investments. I think it's also important from my point of view, and I have read, Perry Merling's stuff, right, where it's not so much interest rates, it's more the other side of the equation of stabilizing asset prices, right? So, since we go on to a fiat currency, with the Fed just being able to create reserves, that's now sort of taking this position of stabilizing asset prices, which feeds into the financialization of the economy. So this whole, monetary policy now, well, Merling would argue, that the Fed is just kind of playing both sides of the market to stabilize asset prices. And then you could even go from there and say, well, that's also responsible for the deindustrialization, but things that cause low inflation, right? So that's that whole, there's no relationship anymore between employment and inflation, or wages and wage growth and employment, because you have the growing financialization of the economy, because you have rising asset prices that are being stabilized continually by the Fed, and that itself results in, of course, rising income inequality, handing income over to people with lower marginal propensities to consume, these types of structural features that could keep inflation low as well. So in other words, just sort of the whole, and the final thing is that in terms of sort of the growing financialization of the economy leads to lower inflation, as we're relying more and more on importing low-cost goods from other countries, right? So we're doing financial services and importing goods from other countries at very low cost, because they still haven't used up all of their resources to the extent that we have. And then the final point is about the supply You say, well, we'll have to look at the supply of labor. What about the demand for labor? What about the nature of the jobs that people are, is the economy now to work, the employers just want low-skilled service workers. So what about the changing nature of the types of jobs that are out there, that are available?
Yeah.
So a couple of points. Effectively, the job guarantee is properly designed, it's connected to an industrial policy and skills development is a benefit to the supply side, so it's an anti-inflationary measure. And so if it's properly argued for, it doesn't contribute to the wage price spiral concept necessarily, right? And the other thing that I would say though is that the idea that this gets resolved on a technological or technocratic level without the political mobilization of the working class, so without the engagement, not so much of the official trade union movement, but the political mobilization of the working class as a political target is sort of pointless. You're not going to get anywhere if you don't have a mobilized working class that supports it. So it's a political argument across the class that requires political leadership, not just a technocratic. So the model isn't going to win over millions of people, and you're not going to shift the balance of power in the United States or England or Australia without a mobilized working class demanding full employment.
So the question of obviously outsourcing and the declining union density and union power in general is an important contributor to the low inflation that we've seen, which the Fed is taking credit for. So I think there's a little bit of a link there. And even Paul Volcker in his memoir talks about, we're talking about this yesterday, how Reagan broke the air traffic controller strike. And by doing so, he gave a signal to the private sector employers that it is okay to do that. And, so then combined with the neoliberal policies of suppressing aggregate demand and then tapping into cheap labor in China and elsewhere, we've been able to achieve lower inflation rates, which the Fed is taking credit for. At the same time, you could say we've had an asset price inflation, right? If that's what you're referring to, which is linked to the financialization. From a post-Keynesian / Minskian perspective, asset price stabilization should be the Fed's job, right? So in some sense, does the Fed affect the distribution of income and assets, right, by doing so? And how do you stabilize it in a way where you don't exacerbate existing inequalities? But asset prices have to be stabilized, otherwise you get into financial crisis. Now, what do you do afterwards? How do you regulate it to prevent the increasing financialization, to prevent the another threat of an asset price deflation where the Fed is forced to come in, right? That's also the job of the central bank in terms of regulation, right? In terms of trying to prevent some of that financialization of the economy that we've been seeing. So a more reasonable, I would say, policy framework would say, okay, fiscal policy has to deal with, as Minsky says, the big government is the stabilizer of employment and output prices. And that's where the job guarantee comes into the picture as well. And the central bank's job is to act as a lender of last resort, prevent financial crisis, and so on and so forth. Even most recently, right, we see that I would argue the changing of interest rates goes against the asset price stabilization mandate of the Fed, right, or the financial stability. I mean, we saw the failure of the Silicon Valley Bank. Who else is holding the increased interest rate? I mean, the interest rate risk, right? Who else is holding it in the economy? I don't know, right? Who's going to be the next domino to fall? And then obviously after that, the Fed did something unprecedented where they said, we will lend to you if you have a treasury security, and we will lend it at par values, right? We're kind of going to ignore this depreciation in asset values, which our interest rate policies have caused. If they hadn't done that, I think that Silicon Valley Bank situation was going to spiral out of control, if not for that intervention.
Yeah. Maybe just on the demand part. So I totally agree with the broader problem of lower quality, more precarious, shorter term, gig type jobs. That's been a lot of the employment generated. Where it maybe ties in a little more directly to this presentation, so that that weighting system that happens on the labor supply. Some of the papers do the same thing with vacancies, right? So we'll only count the vacancies that tend to get hired more, and that has the exact same effect of making the labor market look more and more efficient. You're just doing it on both sides now. So.
We have 5 more minutes, so let's take a couple more questions and keep the questions short and then the answers short. So let's start.
My question is this: the record of central banks in actually meeting their inflation targets, like if you look at the last 50 more than, is actually very poor, whether it's deflation or. But nevertheless, the myth that central banks are capable of this continues to persist. Any thoughts on that?
Why it continues to persist, so the millions.
Let's take a
Yeah,
couple.
okay.
Well, more and then,
Yeah, my question is for Kyle about the second presentation, and I consider it really interesting. And I have a quick question about if you are taking a look to a new Phillips curve that the central banks and policymakers are trying to justify the new measures of the NAIRU, but it's more like all the unemployment is determined by the long run term. So it could be, of course, it's just a policy of composition that we are taking in the class of practice. So it will be helpful if you take up your copy about that new justification of the long-term unemployment. It's the new Phillips curves that it's quickly they are trying to change the marginal cost instead of the wages. So it's like another view of the orthodox theoretical. So that's
yes, then the final questions.
Yeah, I actually have one for each of them, so. So I think it'll be quick. So Rohan, I'm just curious, you were talking, you made the analogy to educating children early on. And to me, that still comes back to sort of the core issue we're still at, in the sense that 9 times out of 10, when I see somebody talking about the job guarantee, they don't understand that it replaces unemployment, and it is not replacing literally any other policy. Like every policy you are in favor of right now is consistent with involuntary unemployment. So it's also consistent with the job guarantee, right? And so job guarantee at its core means there's a job for everybody that wants one. It's like, right? Like you're against puppies if you're against that, right? So, okay. For Kyle, I'm just curious, have you seen any of them notice that what they're doing is just bringing this closer and closer to a 90? I'll let you in. And for Yeva, I'm curious about what you see is, and you may have addressed this, so sorry if I missed it, inconsistencies between 2019 Fed and 2023 Fed.
Let's try and answer in 1 minute.
To the other point, yeah, obviously we need a broad-based working class movement, and part of that is these ideas get manifested, they get put out there. We're trying to do that. There may be ways that we reframe it that are going to get more of a wildfire spark. But secondly, union leadership does have an educational effect. It has a signaling effect. What they set as priorities do filter down to what people see. And conversely, if they're getting signals from people they trust heuristically that this is something to be skeptical of, that does trickle down to some degree. It's not the people that have their own agency, but it can affect. To Scott's point, yeah, I mean, I think obviously I'm on team member team, like I'm here, like I don't agree this is the priority. At the same time, I think there is a dialectic, right? Part of the reason we're saying we're doing this is it should have a massively empowering effect on labor the day after if we do it right. In which case, there may be a lot more militant wage demands than we had the day before, or at least it is going to affect the relative internal power structure of the union movement. So there is a dialectic. You can't just say ceteris paribus, we're going to leave everything else the same.
I'm curious how many of them understand.
I don't know how many of them understand it, but I think they're also thinking of that second tier effect, right? Sure. Like they're thinking of we might like it, but it's going to change our relative stuff. I think we just have to be also operating. I think you're right. The first order thing matters the most. But it's the second order thing that's actually politically in the way.
The first order thing.
I'm sorry, but
I'm done. That's all.
Yeah, so you can continue that later, so we can give Kyle and Yeva.
I think there is. I think there's some recognition about it going to the identity, but I think there's still the sense I have is there's an importance attributed to that idea of there's some frictions or inefficiency here that we need to gauge.
And whether that's because different people are in here, right? So there's some effort there to take into account diversity, the heterogeneity of workforce. Just the weighting system is about the worst way you could do it. But they want to kind of have that efficiency measure there, and it goes back into the natural rate estimates and everything. So I think that's where they're a lot of the tension is.
Yeah, on the myth of the central bank, I think the revision of the framework is a recognition that the myth may not be holding for too long, right? Because they weren't able to hit their inflation targets, and they are worried that people might start noticing, and then what other repercussions that has. So I mean, why the myth persists? I'm really not sure. I mean, there's a lot of there is this sense that monetary policy is very technocratic, very scientific, very science-based. I mean, some of these researchers say we have this framework which we've refined, and like we can't just jettison it because it's like we've worked on it, you know, spend all of this time and money on it. So, but I feel like the cracks are there. And this kind of relates to Scott's point, right? Like you did this whole revision in 2019, 2020, and then you now have to revise it all again because of what happened and what you did, right? Because you were saying, well, slack in the economy, not correlated with inflation, but now you kind of have to say, well, maybe not, because, and that's why we have to raise interest rates, right? Or they have come under attack from economists for like getting rid of this preemptive rate increases. So that's another thing which they might have to go back on and saying, well, maybe we should do the preemptive rate increases because look what happened when we did it. So they have definitely come under attack from economists saying changing the framework was the wrong thing to do, and look at what you did. Yeah.
Okay, thank you, everyone.